peer review or poor review. You decide. Quoted with Pseudoskeptics in mind, Randy Devities, by Dave Smith at Thunderbolts Info. If peer review was a drug, it would never be allowed onto the market. Recently a paper has been published in a peer review journal, which examines and explains many of the pitfalls of peer review. The paper, titled Classical Peer Review, an empty gun by Richard Smith, is a study which is focused on medical review, but which applies to all scientific disciplines. From Smith's study: if peer review was a drug, it would never be allowed onto the market, says Drummond Rennie, deputy editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, and intellectual father of the International Congresses of Peer Review, that have been held every 4 years, since 1989. Peer review would not get onto the market, because we have no convincing evidence of its benefits, but a lot of evidence of its flaws. Yet, to my continuing surprise, almost no scientists know anything about the evidence on peer review. It is a process that is central to science, deciding which grant proposals will be funded, which papers will be published, who will be promoted, and who will receive a Nobel Prize. We might thus expect that scientists, people who are trained to believe nothing until presented with evidence, would want to know all the evidence available on this important process. Yet not only do scientists know little about the evidence on peer review, but most continue to believe in peer review, thinking it essential for the progress of science. Ironically, a faith-based rather than an evidence-based process lies at the heart of science. So to think about that, pseudoskeptics. Much ado is made about the value of peer review to science, yet could it be that such faith is unwarranted? If science is about having evidence to support claims made, do we really have any evidence to support the system which supports the sciences? It seems no is the only truthful answer to that question. Drummond Rennie writes, in what might be the greatest sentence ever published in a medical journal, there seems to be no study too fragmented, no hypothesis too trivial, no literature citation too biased or too egotistical, no design too warped, no methodology too bungled, no presentation of results too inaccurate, too obscure, and too contradictory, no analysis too self-serving, no argument too circular, no conclusions too trifling or too unjustified, and no grammar and syntax too offensive for a paper to end up in print. One could easily be forgiven for thinking Rennie was talking about cosmology, astrophysics, particle physics, solar physics, or any other discipline which allows conjecture and bias to trump good scientific method. In fact, if this is the case in the medical sciences, where people's lives and quality thereof is at stake, how much more is it likely to be the case in disciplines where the only real stakeholders are those whose qualifications and continued employment depend on the promotion of a particular paradigm, however speculative? We have little or no evidence that peer review works, but we have lots of evidence of its downside. James Randy Devities, Pseudoskeptics, take note here. Frequently those who spend their spare time touring forums and comments threads of science news sites will see demands for peer-reviewed papers to back up dissent in claims. These demands are most commonly made by those with a close bond to the status quo, or what could be termed conventional wisdom. That's pseudoskeptics. This is in spite of the fact that there is little evidence of the efficacy of the peer review process, which is supposed to vet published material. Smith has identified 5 key areas within which the current peer review system has serious issues. 1. Cost. Firstly, it is very expensive in terms of money and academic time. The Research Information Network has calculated that the global cost of peer review is $1.9 billion. The cost in time is also enormous, and many scientists argue that time spent peer reviewing would be better spent doing science. 2. Slow. Secondly, peer review is slow. The process regularly takes months, and sometimes years. Publication may then take many more months. A friend of mine, a fellow of the Royal Society, has written a paper that I think very important for global health. As I write, it is still unpublished after 2 years of being reviewed by several top journals. None of the reviewers have raised a major flaw with the study. 3. Lottery-like. Thirdly, peer review is largely a lottery. Multiple studies have shown how if several authors are asked to review a paper, their agreement on whether it should be published is little higher than would be expected by chance. 4. Does not detect errors. A fourth problem with peer reviews is that it does not detect errors. At the British Medical Journal we took a 600-word study that we were about to publish and inserted 8 errors. We then sent the paper to about 300 reviewers. The median number of errors spotted was 2, and 20% of the reviewers did not spot any. We did further studies of deliberately inserting errors, some very major, and came up with similar results. One of the catch cries of those who espouse that peer-reviewed papers are the only scientifically valid sources of information is that the process ensures correctness of the research. Clearly, this is not the case. Again, it is worth mentioning that this study is based on medical peer review, where errors could have broad and tragic consequences. If errors are not detected in the medical peer review process, is it any more likely that they would identify it in other disciplines? 5. Bias. The fifth problem with pre-publication peer review is bias. There have been many studies of bias with conflicting results, but the most famous was published in Behavioral and Brain Sciences. The authors took 12 studies that came from prestigious institutions that had already been published in psychology journals. They retyped the papers, made minor changes to the titles, abstracts, and introductions, but changed the authors' names and institutions. They invented institutions with names like the Tri-Valley Center for Human Potential. The papers were then resubmitted to the journals that had first published them. In only 3 cases did the journals realize that they had already published the paper, and 8 of the remaining 9 were rejected, not because of lack of originality, but because of poor quality. The authors concluded that this was evidence of bias against authors from less prestigious institutions. Most authors from less prestigious institutions, particularly those in the developing world, believe that peer review is biased against them. 6. Easily abused. Finally, peer review can be all too easily abused. Reviewers can steal ideas and present them as their own, or produce an unjustly harsh review to block, or at least slow down the publication of the ideas of a competitor. These have all happened. Recently in the discipline of climate science, it was revealed that a group of scientists not only sought to suppress dissenting work, but also to discredit a journal in its entirety, a clear-cut case of both bias within and abuse of the peer review system. So where does this leave us? The public at large have, quite understandably, grown suspicious of many of the sciences. One result of this is the explosion of a plethora of websites, questioning much of what we are led to believe. But with much information comes much disinformation, and it is becoming more difficult to draw the line between sound criticism of a popular paradigm and dissent for the sake of dissent. This author is of the opinion that several other measures should also be considered to help improve the current peer review system. Reviewers could be identified whilst authors and their affiliations retain anonymity until publication. This would have the twofold effect of allowing the research to stand on its own merits, and add accountability to the reviewers. All comments regarding a paper could be published to allow third parties to evaluate any criticisms offered. After all, under the current system, who reviews the reviewers? Dave Smith. Thunderbolts. Info.